So now we get to this section in which we talk about different theories of emotion. And this is a very, very interesting area to look at because, different researchers have very different takes on how and what is the basis of emotion, right? So having looked at the three different components of emotion, the cognitive component, the behavioral component, and the physiological component, we now turn to looking at different theories of emotion. Now, when we see this image, right? So here you have the common sense view at the right at the top, right? So this is right at the top here is the common sense view, right? Which basically says that I tremble because I feel afraid, which basically means that you have the cognitive component. Actually, let's just do this on another page, right? So the common sense view it holds that I tremble because I am afraid, right? And what that basically shows is that this is the trembling is the physiological component, or it is what we call the autonomic arousal, right? And the fear, because I'm afraid, right? This is the cognitive component. So then the common sense view seems to hold that the cognitive component comes first, and that causes, so this leads to the physiological component. Make sense? Right? So, you feel butterflies in your stomach, which is the physiological component, because you are extremely happy, right? The happiness is the cognitive component, right? So this is the common sense view. This is what we all sort of believe, right? But then what happened was that along came James and Lang, which are two different people who sort of talked about this theory at the same time. And that is why this theory right here is called the James Lang theory. And they sort of reversed it, right? And what they said was that, what they say is, I feel afraid because I tremble. So with the James Lang theory, you have a reversal. It's the opposite. So they say that I feel afraid. Oh no, what was it? I feel afraid because I tremble, yes. So I feel afraid because I tremble. So here what they're trying to say is that there is, when we go back, so there is autonomic arousal. You see the stimulus, which is this very scary looking dog here. So what that does is the stimulus leads to the autonomic arousal or the physiological component. This is basically the physiological component. And the physiological component leads to the feeling of being afraid, which is basically the cognitive component. So here they've reversed it, right? And what James Lang theory, what it holds is that there are different patterns of autonomic arousal for each emotion. So for happiness, right, there is a different autonomic arousal, different pattern of autonomic arousal, right? And when your body feels that autonomic arousal, then it says that it feels happy, right? For sadness, there is different pattern of autonomic arousal. For fear, there is a different pattern of autonomic arousal, right? And then whenever you have all of these different forms of autonomic arousal, then only you have the experience of the cognitive component of the feeling, right? So with happiness, there is a particular autonomic arousal which is unique to happiness, right? And that leads to the cognitive component, right? Or the feeling of being happy, right? Same is the case with sadness. There is a particular autonomic arousal which leads to the cognitive component or the feeling of being sad, right? Similarly, with fear, you have a particular autonomic arousal that leads to the cognitive component or the feeling of being afraid, right? So this is what the James Lang theory is about, right? But then what happened was along came Cannonbard, and what they sort of researched on was that they negated this idea, which is, the assumption behind James Lang theory, which is that every emotion, right? Every emotion has a unique pattern of autonomic arousal. What that basically means is that James Lang thought that for every emotion, there is a different pattern of autonomic arousal. For happiness, there is another pattern. For sadness, there's another pattern. For fear, there's another pattern. What Cannonbard discovered was that if you're happy or if you're fearful, your autonomic arousal pretty much looks the same, right? So here we talk about the Cannonbard theory of emotion, right? So Cannonbard, they came across this idea that autonomic arousal for different emotions looks pretty much the same. So even if you're happy, your heart rate goes up. Even if you're fearful, your heart rate goes up. Um, you know, it might be that you start sweating during a state of surprise, but then you also start sweating when you're fearful, right? So what they said was that autonomic arousal is not necessarily different given different emotions, right? And when we go back to this, what we see is that they introduced two different kinds of components here. So they said that, when you see a stimulus, you see this very dangerous looking dog, you know, you have signals sent to your brain, right? And your brain then simultaneously activates both the conscious feeling of being afraid, and it also, at the same time, simultaneously brings about the autonomic arousal, right? So it's something that's happening side by side, right? That you have the stimulus and then you have, subcortical brain activity, which is doing two different things simultaneously, right? So it is bringing forth the cognitive component or the subjective experience of a particular feeling, right? And it's also bringing about the physiological arousal or the autonomic arousal. right? So Cannonbard believed that these things happen side by side and not that, one happens before the other, because according to James Lang, the autonomic arousal happens before the cognitive component, right? The the cognitive component is caused by the autonomic arousal, whereas in the common sense view, it's the opposite. It's the cognitive component that causes the physiological component, right? But in Cannonbard, what they did was that they said that this happens, both of these processes happen simultaneously, right? So this is the change that they introduced. Then you get this another theory, which is Shakhtars theory of emotion, which talks about how, what happens is that you label your trembling as fear because you appraise the situation as dangerous. Now, this is another revision. And here, what's happening is that you see this very dangerous looking dog, and this makes up your stimulus. Because of this, you will get some form of autonomic arousal. Then, what happens is that you look around you and you appraise the situation. What that means is that you evaluate the situation, and then that results in the cognitive feeling being present. So, basically, if I were to break this down, what Shakhtars theory is saying is that first there is autonomic arousal, right? Which means that there is the physiological component, right? That your heart starts to race and you start to sweat, right? That results in you looking around you, right? And evaluating the situation, right? So it is what we call cognitive appraisal, or we can call it simply appraisal of the environment, right? So you look around you, and what you see is that there is, you see simultaneously that your heart rate is increasing, and then you see that, there's a very deadly dog standing in front of you, right? And then this results in the cognitive component, right? So you say that my heart is racing and there is an extremely dangerous dog standing in front of me. So I must be feeling afraid, right? So this is, what leads to the subjective experience of the feeling. So it's basically, according to Schachter, the autonomic arousal comes first. That autonomic arousal is followed by an appraisal or an evaluation. So what happens here is that the person looks around them to see why is this autonomic arousal happening. So if, for example, you had that autonomic arousal, but standing in front of you rather than this very dangerous dog was, your best friend holding a huge amount of balloons and a birthday cake, right? So then you would appraise this situation as surprising, and then the cognitive component here would not be fear, right? Would not be the subjective feeling of fear, but the subjective feeling of surprise, right? So this is what Schachtars theory is about, that you label your trembling or you label your autonomic arousal as fear because you appraise the situation as dangerous, right? When you looked around and you tried to evaluate, what you saw was that because there's a dangerous dog standing there, you say that, you basically, that leads to the cognitive component coming up, which is that of fear. But if there is autonomic arousal and there's no dog, rather there's your friend standing there holding, gifts and balloons and, birthday cake for you, and it's also your birthday, right? So then your appraisal or your evaluation will lead to a different cognitive component, which might be, the cognitive component of the feeling of surprise, right? So this is basically what these different theories of emotion are about.